How to read a Magic the Gathering card. When your opponent plays a card that you are not familiar with, you might be tempted to ask, "Can I read that?" To which they may reply, "I don't know, can you?" While I expect even the newest of Magic the Gathering players to be able to read the words on a card, there are many times when this will not be enough because each word might bear the weight of paragraphs in the comprehensive rules. I selected the card Emergency Powers for this episode because I wanted to talk about zones, and this card interacts with most of them. Let's start by going over all of the elements of the card we have already discussed and then dig into the new ones. This card is named Emergency Powers. The casting cost is 5 generic mana, a white mana, and a blue mana. The total amount of mana required to cast the spell on this card is 7, so the mana value of this card is 7. There are no additional indicators of color, so this card is white and blue because of the colors in the casting cost. Notice that the frame is mostly gold, which means it is a multicolor card. The white and blue piping serve as a reminder of the card's color. The only colors appearing on this card are the white and blue in the mana symbols of the casting cost, so the color identity of this card is also white and blue. The card type is instant. Instant and sorcery spells are non-permanent, so the rules text in the text box describes any additional requirements for casting the spell and the effects of the spell being resolved. While Emergency Powers doesn't have one, some instant or sorcery spells will have a spell type. Like creature types, spell types mostly don't do anything on their own. Arcane spells work with the splice mechanic, and lesson spells work with the learn mechanic. Some cards have an additional spell attached to them with the adventure spell type that can be cast from the card. If the adventure spell is resolved, the card is exiled. If a card with adventure is exiled this way, the non-adventure part of it can be cast from exile. There are other cases where the casting of a spell with a specific type will interact with other card effects or abilities with wording like, whenever you cast a spell that has an adventure, or arcane spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. The trap spell type is only used for instants and mostly seems to be a label for cards with similar alternate casting cost prerequisites. We can tell from the set symbol and RNA in the footer that this card is from the set Ravnica Allegiance. We can tell from the mythic orange color of the set symbol and the M in the footer that this card is mythic rare. Since around 2015, rares, mythic rares, and other special cards will often have a holofoil stamp that helps validate the authenticity of a printed card. We also have art depicting the in-universe events this spell represents, and the artist credit. The collector number on this card is 169 out of 259, and the printing language is English. Down here we have a trademark and a copyright notice from Wizards of the Coast, the publisher of Magic the Gathering. This particular card also has the words Story Spotlight and the URL mtgstory.com. The cards in a Magic the Gathering set often tie to a series of events in the Magic the Gathering universe. In many recent Magic the Gathering sets, certain cards that represent key events in the Magic the Gathering storyline have some fiction you can read on the website to find out more about what is being depicted on the card. The effects of Emergency Powers will be resolved in the order they appear on the card. Once a spell has started resolving, players cannot take most game actions until they have fully resolved. This means that players will not be able to cast spells or activate most abilities between the two effects unless they are directed to do so by the effects of the spell. Players can cast instant spells anytime they have priority. Players can only cast sorcery spells when they have priority on their own turn during a main phase. Priority is one of those complex concepts in Magic the Gathering that is hard to understand in theory, but is usually pretty straightforward in practice. Essentially, the active player has priority in each step, phase, or stacked effect resolution. Once a player passes priority, it moves to the next player in turn order. Once all players have passed priority, the game can progress to the next step, phase, or stacked effect resolution, and priority is returned to the active player. I suppose I should mention that the active player is the player whose turn it is. We sometimes use the phrase sorcery speed or as a sorcery and instant speed or as an instant to indicate when certain game actions can be taken. For example, we might say spells with flash can be cast as instant speed, or an ability on a permanent might say activate only as a sorcery to prevent it from being activated during combat or on an opponent's turn. The activate only as an instant phrasing on Diamond Lion is a weird edge case that prevents this ability from being used as a mana ability. There are certain game actions that are faster than instant speed. Mana abilities, which are abilities that could add mana to your mana pool without needing a target, and a subset of special actions, like turning a morph or megamorph creature face up, that can be performed at any time and don't interact with the stack. While a player normally needs to have priority when activating a mana ability or taking a special action, they will have the opportunity to do so anytime doing so would be relevant. For example, if the effect of an opponent's spell is giving a player the option to pay a mana cost, that player can tap a forest or sacrifice a creature to Ashnod's altar to add mana to their mana pool to pay that cost. There is also a keyword ability, Split Second, which makes a spell just slightly faster than instant speed. Players can't take any instant speed actions until the split second effect has been resolved, but players can, however, still activate mana abilities and take any available special actions. And additionally, triggered abilities will still trigger and will be put on the stack above, and therefore be resolved before the split second effects. As I've mentioned in my previous videos, and worth repeating before we move on, almost anything one might say is true of Magic the Gathering comes with the caveat, unless an in-game effect changes this. This mutability is a key feature of Magic the Gathering, so it is important to understand how every card might be changing the rules. One of the effects on emergency powers is prefaced with the word addendum in italics. Addendum is what is called an ability word. Ability words are a little like a keyword ability, but without any meaning in the rules. All of the cards with addendum do something extra or different only when they are cast during your main phase. While an ability word doesn't tell you exactly what the effect will be, like a keyword ability, effects with the same ability word typically relate to each other mechanically, and the ability word serves as a reminder to pay attention to certain rules, game actions, timings, etc. Some recent examples: landfall abilities trigger when a land enters the battlefield under your control, and magecraft abilities trigger whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell. You may also see effects or abilities similarly prefaced with flavor words that are equally irrelevant to the rules but also don't relate to the mechanics. These words are just to help you understand what the ability represents in the fiction of the game. As with flavor text and reminder text, ability words and flavor words will always be printed in italics and never have any rules relevant impact on the game. While emergency powers might not have any keyword abilities, it certainly has a number of words on it that require knowledge of relevant game rules to interpret. Of note, hand, graveyard, library, exile, and battlefield are zones. Zones are places where game stuff, like cards or permanents or markers, can be during a game of Magic the Gathering. In addition to those mentioned explicitly on the card emergency powers, we also have the stack, the command zone, and the anti-zone. If a card isn't in a zone, it is outside of the game. Feel free to comment on this video explaining how phased out cards are neither in a zone nor outside of the game. This is true, but only because we are pretending they don't exist at the time. While in principle, cards outside of the game could be all of the Magic the Gathering cards that exist and that would be legal to play in a particular game, format, and deck you are playing, in practice, cards you own outside of the game are typically just those in your sideboard. Silver-bordered cards and Mystery Booster playtest cards have introduced additional zones, but those would only be relevant in a very narrow set of circumstances that I've decided are not in scope for this video. Assuming the standard rules of Magic the Gathering, each player brings a deck of 60 cards and, optionally, a 15-card sideboard. The game starts with the deck being shuffled and placed face down to form a library, and the sideboard being set aside as cards you own outside of the game. Most of the time, when the rules refers to cards you own, they mean the cards you brought to the game in either your deck or sideboard. Your library is your personal pile of cards to draw from. It is kept face down and the order is maintained unless a game action directs you to adjust it. For example, when you scry, you can reorder the top cards of your library and or put cards on the bottom of your library. No player will typically know the exact order of any player's library beyond the specific cards revealed to them as part of game effect. Generally speaking, if you need to look at the order of the cards incidentally as part of a game effect, like searching your library for a basic land, you'll also be directed to shuffle your library. Moving cards from the top of your library into your hand is normally called drawing, but there are cases where a player may look at the top card of their library and then put it into their hand that don't count, technically speaking, as drawing. A player may only have cards they own in their hand. Each player's hand is entirely visible to that player, but only the number of cards in a player's hand is typically known to their opponents. If you have more than your maximum hand size of cards, typically 7, in your hand at the beginning of the cleanup step of the ending phase of your own turn, you will need to discard cards down to that number. Unless a card's effect says otherwise, you may only play cards from your hand. How you play cards depends on the card. You play lands by putting them from your hand onto the battlefield. You play spells by casting them and putting them onto the stack. There are also times when you can activate an ability from a card in hand without playing it, as with Cycling, Channel, and Foretell. When you discard a card, you put it from your hand into the graveyard. Your graveyard is a face-up pile for your cards. These could be destroyed permanents, instants, and sorceries after they have been cast, or really any card that is sent there by an action or effect. There are quite a few mechanics that care about cards in the graveyard. Allow cards to be moved out of the graveyard in one way or another, allow you to play cards from your graveyard, or even cards with abilities that can be activated from the graveyard. You can't really consider cards to be gone when they are just in the graveyard. To account for this, there is the Exile Zone. Exiled cards are effectively, but not technically, removed from the game. As a convenient place to store cards where players are unlikely to be able to interact with them, card effects will often exile a card, but also establish a way that card may be moved back out of exile. This can be thought of as setting them aside, rather than removing them from the game. If an effect exiles a card without setting up a way for it to later be moved back out of exile, it is very unlikely it will return. In earlier printings, Magic the Gathering cards used phrases like set aside or removed from the game to direct you to move a card from within the game to outside of the game. At some point, the designers codified this to be the Exile Zone. The Exile Zone is explicitly distinct from cards you own outside of the game now, whereas before, this was potentially ambiguous. The battlefield is where you, and your opponents, keep the permanents you control. Each player has their own space in the battlefield where the permanents they control are kept. When a card is on the battlefield, it is treated as a permanent. When a permanent represented by a card is destroyed, it is treated as a card again once it moves to its owner's graveyard. Worth noting, while in practice you are expected to keep the cards you control in your own space, the battlefield is a common zone. If an opponent takes control of a permanent you control, it is not leaving your battlefield. While it is possible for cards on the battlefield under your control to belong to another player, you may only have cards you own in your library, hand, and graveyard. As such, if a permanent you control is destroyed, and you do not own the card it represents, this card will be sent to its owner's graveyard, not yours. The same is true for permanents being sent to the hand or library. Many times, permanents are not represented by a card, either because they are created that way, or because they are copies. Permanents like this are called tokens, and they can only exist on the battlefield. When a token permanent leaves the battlefield, it stops existing after it arrives at the destination zone. Because of this, tokens will still trigger any effects relating to being moved right before they stop existing. A copy of a permanent spell resolves by becoming a token copy of the permanent the copied spell would become when entering the battlefield. At the time of recording, there is only one card, Garth One-Eye, that creates copies of cards. Copies of cards can only exist while the ability that creates them is being resolved. If a copy of a card is cast, or the ability that creates it is fully resolved without it being cast, the copy ceases to exist. The stack is more of a concept than a real zone. Cards can only be in the stack zone between when they are cast and when they are resolved. Similarly to how permanent cards on the battlefield are mostly there to represent the permanent they've summoned, cards on the stack are mostly there to represent the effects on being cast. The effects of spells, abilities, special actions, etc. are resolved in a last-in, first-out order. When an effect interacts with the stack, it will typically do so by targeting spells or abilities. Think of spell cards as scrolls that can be used to cast spells. You can target the scroll in the wizard's hand, but you can't target the spell itself unless they start casting it. The command zone is I wanted to say it was irrelevant outside of the Commander format and other formats with Commander-like mechanics like Brawl and Oathbreaker, but it turns out it is relevant even in the Standard format. Somehow, while I wasn't paying attention, a bunch of rules started putting other stuff in the Command Zone. I'm just going to go with the official wording here. The Command Zone is a game area reserved for certain specialized objects that have an overarching effect on the game, yet are not permanents and cannot be destroyed. The most commonly known use for the Command Zone is as a special place for you to keep the legendary creature card you've selected as your commander in a game of the Commander format. As a special rule of the Commander format, you can play that card anytime that it would be legal for you to do so from your hand. When your commander changes zones in any way, other than being moved onto the stack or battlefield, you have the choice of returning it to the command zone once it arrives there. For example, if your commander is destroyed, exiled, returned to hand, or discarded, you can put it back into the command zone. Each time you cast your commander from the command zone, you pay a tax of 2 generic mana for each time it had previously been cast this way. There are also a number of objects like emblems, conspiracies, and dungeons that sometimes exist in the command zone. I suppose they just needed a place for these to technically be in order to work with their other rules. Finally, we have the anti-zone. All of the cards that interact with the anti-zone are banned in all sanctioned formats where they might otherwise be legal, but the concept is still technically in the comprehensive rules. Put simply, when playing for anti, before the first turn each player puts a card at random from their library into the anti-zone, and at the end of the game, the winner takes ownership of the cards in the anti-zone. Some people might say that opening booster packs is a little like gambling, but playing for anti is definitely exactly gambling, so given that Magic the Gathering is marketed to children, doing so is frowned upon and often illegal. Now that we've discussed all of the relevant zones, we can proceed. When you cast or copy emergency powers, you put the spell onto the stack. Once it is on the stack, and you've passed priority, your opponents have an opportunity to respond. Your opponent may choose to cast instant or faster speed spells, take instant or faster speed actions, or activate instant or faster speed abilities in response to this spell being cast. If your opponent takes an action that counters your spell, like casting Counterspell and targeting emergency powers, the new effect will be added to the stack on top of emergency powers, and therefore resolve first, preventing emergency powers from resolving. When a spell is countered in this way, it fizzles on the stack and the card representing it will be sent directly to its owner's graveyard. Spells can also fizzle if they are prevented from resolving in other ways. One straightforward example would be to sacrifice your last creature as an additional cost to casting an instant spell in response to an opponent casting a spell that targets a creature they don't control. Your opponent may also see that the effect of this spell will cause them to return their hand and graveyard to their library and choose to respond by activating an ability of a card in their graveyard before it gets shuffled into their library, or by casting a spell from hand that will spoil your plans. Because the stack is last in, first out, the effects of these spells or abilities would be resolved before emergency powers. Once all of the other text on the stack above emergency powers are resolved, the effects described by the rules text on emergency powers can be resolved. The first effect is, each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7 cards, exile emergency powers. Now that we know what all of these words mean, this isn't at all difficult to understand. Each player will combine all of the cards from their hand, graveyard, and library, shuffle them, and then return them all face down to the library zone. After doing this, they will draw 7 cards by moving them from their library to their hand. After all players have completed those actions, the spell will be sent from the stack to the exile zone, where it becomes a card again, or if it was copied, ceases to exist. The second effect is, if you cast the spell during your main phase, you may put a permanent card with mana value 7 or less from your hand onto the battlefield. Quick aside, this card has not been reprinted since the Oracle text was changed from converted mana cost to mana value. While this particular change has no rules impact, it is worth noting that the Oracle's rules text is what you should read when determining what a card does. Sometimes reading the card means looking up Oracle text. As this second effect is qualified with an if, we first need to determine if this effect will happen or not. The first and most obvious prerequisite is that this second effect will only happen if it is the main phase of the person casting the spell. The second and less obvious prerequisite is that this spell must have been cast. There are certain game effects that allow you to copy a spell while it is on the stack, and the use of the term cast in the rules text stipulates that, for the effect to happen, the card must have been cast and not copied. If these prerequisites are met, the person casting the spell is allowed to put a permanent with mana value 7 or less from their hand onto the battlefield. Note that the player will not be playing or casting the card, so abilities relating to casting or playing the card won't be triggered, but effects related to the permanent entering the battlefield under their own control will. As I mentioned earlier, the effects of spells are resolved in the order they appear on the card, so the cards you are putting from your hand onto the battlefield will be one from the 7 cards you draw while resolving the first effect. The word may is used when an action is not required. In a way, Magic the Gathering uses the term may in both the are allowed to and might possibly senses. While you need to have a permanent card in your hand with mana value 7 or less when the effect resolves to take advantage of the opportunity, this effect still happens even if you don't happen to have one, or if you do and choose not to put it onto the battlefield. Normally, once an instant or sorcery spell resolves, it would be sent from the stack to the graveyard, but in this case it can't because the spell exiled itself as part of its effects. Extending my earlier metaphor, the scroll used to cast the spell isn't there to be thrown in the recycle bin because the effects of the spell vaporized it. Reading Magic the Gathering cards might not be simple, but if you understand all of the words on a card and the rules they engage with, it should be straightforward. This episode is about zones because I ran a poll on Twitter. Thanks, one person who voted, whoever you are. If you were to follow me on Twitter, you too could potentially influence future videos. I suppose you could also just comment on my videos with suggested topics. I'm still getting few enough comments on each video that I read them all. When I started this series, I didn't know if I would make more videos, but the two I've put out so far keep getting likes and views and comments, so I've made this one to keep the ball rolling. Following me on Twitter and or subscribing to this YouTube channel, along with liking, sharing, and commenting on my videos, all serve to encourage me to keep it all going. If you actually want to learn how to play Magic the Gathering, and not just how to read Magic the Gathering cards, I've linked to a couple of places that might be helpful in the description. Thank you so much for watching.